My name is David Stopps. I was brought up in Prince's Risborough. I've lived in Aylesbury all my life since then. I started Friars Aylesbury in 1969 with some friends of mine, including Robin Pike and a few others. And I'm an author, I'm an artist manager, and I do a few other things as well.
Can you tell me how you got into the business of Friars Club?
Well, when Robin Pike first came to me and said, why don't we open a club in Aylesbury? I said, oh, I don't think Aylesbury's going to work. I think Wickham, maybe. Yeah, that would be good. But he said, no, I really want to do it in Aylesbury. So I said, oh, okay, well, we'll give it a try and see how we go. And we started at the new Friarage Hall in Aylesbury, which was in Walton Street. It's demolished now. We've actually had 4 venues in Aylesbury. That was the very first. That had a capacity of about 400. We then moved to the Borough Assembly Hall in the Market Square, which was the legendary Friars venue where Bowie played. That had a capacity of 700. We then went to the Civic Centre, which had a capacity of 1,250. And now we're at the Waterside Theatre, which has a capacity of 1,600. So those are the 4 venues we've had since 1969, which is when we started. Yes, that's 53 years ago.
So you started in Friars and what date?
June the 2nd, 1969.
And you went on to...
Well, we're still running it now.
Still running it
now.
Yeah. And you mentioned Bowie. Were there any other big acts that you had there? Were they big acts at the time?
Yes, well they were. We used to have a reputation for getting bands just before they broke big, you know, because we only had capacities, like I say, 700 or 1,250 or whatever it was at the time. And that's the reputation we had. We were always sort of led by music and not by business or money. As I've got older, I've got a bit better at business, but in those days, that was sort of irrelevant. It was just like, what bands can we get? You know, it was completely driven by music. And because we had our ear to the ground, we knew what was happening perhaps more than other promoters. I'd like to think so anyway. So, you know, we'd book a band sort of for 3 months ahead, thinking that by then they would have, you know, had a hit, or a couple of hits maybe. And that often used to happen. I mean, with Genesis, for example, you know, we paid them £10 the first time, and then £15, and then £25, and then £30, and then £50, and eventually £100. And I remember on the night that we paid them £100, Peter Gabriel had me on stage. He brought me out on stage and said, look, this man has paid us £100. We've never been paid £100 by anybody ever before. So that's sort of a good example. We also were involved with like Cockney Rebel before anybody else. That stands out to me. And Bowie, of course. You know, we put our faith in Bowie when nobody else would. Nobody else would touch him. And but we knew about Space Oddity had already been a hit, and we thought we knew he was a good songwriter, but he'd never really played live very much.
So you had Bowie. Was there any other major bands that you could mention to us? Yeah,
lots. But in the punk era particularly, I mean, I was an old hippie, basically, still am. And, you know, we were into the sort of, you know, the Genesises and the Camels and the, you know, all those bands, Focus, all those sort of bands which we put on regularly, Can, those sort of people. And then punk came along, and it was like somebody's turning everything upside down, you know. And at that point I thought, do I want to carry on? Because the ethos of punk was very much, you know, much more violent, much more exciting. But I thought, is this for me? Can we deal with this? Or shall I just bow out at this point? Because it isn't really, I was peace and love, you know, and, you know, flowers and things. And so, but we did do that. And, you know, I remember Elvis Costello's manager, I asked him, say, could we have Elvis back again? Because he was really getting very big. We put him on once, and he then got very big. And he said, you can have Elvis if you shave off your beard and your moustache.
Did you?
No. And we didn't have him again, which was stupid. I should have done it. If I could go back, I would definitely have said, yep, I'll do that, no problem. But I said, no, you can't tell me what facial hair to wear, you know.
Going back to the 70s, just how much did it cost to get into the Friars?
Not a lot. I mean, the first Bowie gig was 50p, you know, to get in. And I think the first one was September 71. And we had America in support, and America have turned out to be a really big band as well, although they didn't turn up on the night. That's another story. When the second time we had Bowie, it was only about 3 months later, in January 72, we charged 65p. So, you know, I mean, the first one didn't sell out. I think we had about 550 people in out of 700. And the second one definitely sold out.
So how would that work? Would you rent the place and then pay
Yes.
them and then make the money that's left over with that, and that would pay for the artist and obviously a bit of change for yourself?
Yes, we were a club, but we had a moving venue. We didn't ever own a venue. Most clubs own their own venue, you know, like the Marquee, for example, in London. But we didn't. We rented it every single time, which was actually very good to do that, because else we'd have gone bust, you know, if we had our own venue trying to run 7 nights a week or something. We just couldn't have done that. So the way we did it, with picking and choosing the bands and picking the dates, we do sometimes 4 a month, you know, 4 Saturdays a month or something like that. In fact, in September 2022, just gone, we did 4 shows at the Waterside, and that's the first time we've done 4 shows in a month since the 70s.
Did the bands have their own equipment, or did you have the equipment all set up for them yourself?
No, they'd always have their own equipment, including PA.
PA.
So they'd come completely self-contained in those days. Never had to provide a PA.
So you're telling me that David Bowie would turn up in a van with a few of his mates and just
Yes.
get the equipment out, and they'd set it up themselves? There'd be no sound man.
Oh, they'd be a sound man.
Yeah.
And they might bring a sound desk.
Yeah.
And they would bring a sound desk, actually, and they would have their own PA. They were quite modest PAs, though. It wasn't very loud.
Yeah.
And often distorted to an extent. I mean, if you go back there now, in fact, someone recorded the very first Bowie gig in September 71, and it's just released. They've tidied it up, the recording, in the studio. There's a hell of a lot you can do in the studio these days to make an old rough recording sound good, and, you know, emphasise the bass and everything else. And actually, in this, I don't know, hold on, I'm going to get this book. This came out yesterday, which is, it's called Divine Symmetry, David Bowie, and it's all about Hunky Dory. And the only date we did with Hunky Dory was the September 71 gig, which is the day he decided he wanted to go out on the road and you know, make a success of it. Because up to that point, he had been writing. He thought he wanted to write for musicals, and he'd done a few live gigs which hadn't been very successful, and so he thought that wasn't for him. But the Friars audience was so enthusiastic for him that he did it, and he did, you know, the Stones' Chuck Berry's Round and Around at the end, and he did the Velvet Underground's Waiting for the Man, and it just went down a complete storm. And he, in the dressing room afterwards, he said to me, he said to the band, he said that this was fantastic tonight, let's go out and do it properly. And that was really a big turning point, that gig in his career. So that's why it's, you know, a lot of people are interested in it. But, you know, he would just turn up, you know, the lights were just the lights that we had in, you know, the permanent lights we had in the building. We wouldn't bring any lights or anything. In fact, when we had Queen, moving on a couple of years in 74, Freddie Mercury took one look at the stage and the lights, said, "We're not doing it, I'm going home." You know, because it wasn't adequate for him. And I remember pleading with him in the Bell Hotel in the Market Square, and the band, you know, we had a meeting with him and the band, and I said, look, you know, this is sold out, we've sold all the tickets, you really got to do it. You know, you're going to let all these fans down and the whole thing. He still wanted to go home. And then Brian May said, look, I've heard from Ian Hunter of Mott the Hoople that it's a really great place to play, and I think we should do it. And Freddie Mercury said, oh, right then. You know, he's going to go home. Anyway, they did do it, and afterwards he said it was one of the best gigs they'd ever done. So, That's another great story. I've got hundreds of stories like this. In fact, I will write the book one day, I promise. I've been, thinking about it for a while.
So tell me, you just told me Bowie's played there, Queen, megastars. What other megastars have you had play there?
Well, and like I say, in the punk period, there was all of them. The Clash, particularly, the Jam, the Slits, all those punk bands. Susie and the Banshees, particularly. All those punk bands played Friars, and we were the only venue in the home counties that would still put on punk, because they tried it in St Albans, they tried it in Wickham, and it had gone horribly wrong. There had been violence and damage to the venue and all sorts of things. But we took a lot of care to make sure that people understood that if they did that, there would be no more music. And we used to give out little leaflets to them as they came in saying, please look after the building, please don't think about violence or doing anything, that would stop us presenting these shows. And because we took that approach, and I work with the police as well, I'd phone up the police every week and say, have we got a lively one this first year or something like that. I remember with band like that, Madness, we'd put Madness on a lot, and Bad Manners and those sort of bands, and they were the most difficult ones. And if I got a message that the Bedford Skins were coming, we all started to shake a bit, a bit terrified. And I'd tell the police, I said, look, we've heard that the Bedford Skins are coming this week. We'll do our very best to make it a big success, but you should know. And because I did that with the police, I think they never objected or tried to get us closed down. And that's why we survived, and St Albans, Wickham and other venues, Dunstable, didn't. Punk was completely banned.
And you were involved in David Bowie having a statue in Buckinghamshire. Can you tell me about that, please? How you started it?
Well, in 2016, January 2016, he sadly passed away, which nobody was really expecting, and suddenly one day we'd heard that he wasn't with us anymore. And he was such an important part of the Friars' story, and Aylesbury was very important to him. For example, on the track 5 Years on the Ziggy Stardust album, he talks about the Market Square. That was Aylesbury Market Square he's talking about there. So I approached the council to see if we could put up a statue of Bowie in the Market Square, because he, like I said, referenced it in the Ziggy Stardust album. There was a lot of resistance at first, and we had to overcome that, and it took a while. We had an event the week after he died in the square, and a lot of people turned up, 2,000 people turned up. We just played Bowie tracks back to back from noon to about 10 o'clock at night. And people signed a petition saying we want a statue, so I was able to present that to the council. So I had to then make sure that it was all right with the Bowie estate, that they would be all right about it. And luckily they said, we're not endorsing anything, but we're not saying no to anything either, which was good enough for me, because that means they weren't saying no to it, so we could carry on. But it took us 2 years to raise the money. We did a Kickstarter campaign with a target of £100,000. And I remember the day before it expired, we were at about £55,000, I think. And I thought, well, it's going to fail. But £55,000 is not bad out of £100,000. That's credible, at least, but, we're going to fail. And then at about 5 o'clock the day before, it suddenly started to move. And by noon the next day, which is when it expired, we were at 115,000. So and then we got Andrew Sinclair to design and make the statue. In the end, it cost about 200 and something thousand, but we had a lot of donations in addition to the Kickstarter campaign.
Can you give me one piece of advice that you could share to inspire others?
Yeah, it's all based on enthusiasm, basically. If I have a choice of going with somebody who's offering me more money than the other person, that's not necessarily the person to go with. It's who's genuinely got the enthusiasm. And if you follow the enthusiasm, you're usually on a safe one. You know, and I would say whatever you do, just give it 100% and be genuinely enthusiastic about it, because that's infectious. That infects other people around you. And suddenly people come on board. And with the Bowie statue is a good example of that, where I just kept going. And it was obvious many times that it wasn't going to happen. But I deep inside, I thought, it's going to happen, I'm going to make this happen. There was an attempt to do one in Brixton, which is where Bowie was born, and that failed because they were far too ambitious and they just didn't raise enough money. But ours succeeded, and you know, that's a good thing. I mean, I did a charity thing for Stage Crew during the COVID lockdown to raise money for Stagehand, which is a charity that looks after Stage Crew, and Stage Crew were having a terrible time because, you know, suddenly they were working and suddenly they had absolutely nothing because the live events stopped. And I had a figure in my head of £50,000, trying to raise £50,000. And in the end, I got everybody involved. I got Clapton involved, I got, you know, Radiohead, I got Billy Bragg, I got all sorts of people. I got, you know, Mark Knopfler. And we raised just over $2.5 million in the end, from a target of £50,000.
Okay, David, thank you very much for your honest answers and the questions that I've thrown at you. I've got to say, you've done loads with music in your lifetime, and bringing Bowie to Aylesbury and bringing a statue to Aylesbury and helping out the Stage Crews with giving them money. You seem like a real genuine good guy of Buckinghamshire, and I'd just like to say you are one of our heroes, Bucks heroes.
Thank you very much, it's been a real pleasure.